And now I am excited to announce our next panel. What's next? The rising influence of our communities in elections and politics. AA and NHPIs are playing a growing role in elections, with their impact expected to increase in the next general election. As one of the fastest growing voter groups in the United States, they have seen rising turnout and greater representation in key states. Our moderator for this panel is Christine Chen. Christine is co-founder and executive director of Asian Pacific Islander American Vote, or APIA Vote, the nation's leading national nonpartisan organization to engage, to educate, and empower Asian American and Pacific Islanders to strengthen their voices and create impact. APIA Vote's mission is to work with local and state community-based organizations to mobilize AAPI communities in electoral and civic engagement. Please join me in welcoming Christine and panelists to the summit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm so privileged and excited for this conversation. API Vote is pleased to have a lot of our national and local partners here. As we really talk about what are we to look at as we head into the 2025 and 2026 election cycle. Today we have Tom Bonnier, the CEO of the Terror Group, with us, Suk Young Oh, the Executive Director of Hamkei Center, Amber Reed, the co-executive director of API New Jersey, and Navdeep Singh, executive director of the Virginia Civic Engagement Table. You know, for the last 4 weeks, I've been literally in a different city every 3 or 4 days. And it's been quite fascinating to go around the country because the same question keeps coming up. People keep asking what needs to be done, how can we increase voter and civic participation around the country, as well as in the local elections this year, and how can they also get involved. With that backdrop, we also know that the April 2025 API data and AP NORC survey has also shown that most APIs disapprove of Trump's handling of key policy issues, including the economy, trade negotiations with other countries, and climate change, all at 71%. At the same time, APIs distrust, or actually API adults trust Democrats more on key issue areas, but are divided on which party they trust more on immigration, the economy, and inflation. Support for deporting all immigrants living in the U.S. illegally remains divided, and API adults are opposed to specific deportation tactics. About 50% of API adults oppose eliminating the constitutional right to birthright citizenship for children born in the U.S., which is also quite surprising considering that the plaintiff was Chinese in the 1898 Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. So with that backdrop, I want to go ahead and kick it off and start with Tom. Can you please level set with us and provide us, some insights about turnout data and what you saw?
Sure, thank you, and it's great to be here with all of you. So when we look at the arc of turnout, and I'll focus specifically on 2024 and what that means going forward very quickly, but prior to the 2020 elections, turnout among the API community was the lowest of any group, registration or participation. And what we saw in 2020 to me was a great marker in terms of the potential for both investment and legislative success, where we saw in the 2020 election, there was a bigger liberalization of voting access due to COVID primarily than we've ever seen in this country, at least that we had seen in over a century. And the end result was record-setting turnout across the board. But when you look at increase in turnout relative to the 2016 presidential election, no group saw turnout increase by more than API voters. And frankly, it wasn't even close. Turnout increased by 10 points as a percentage of eligible population. The next closest group was 6 points. So we're talking about almost doubling the increase of any other group. And again, part of that was policy-based, but a huge part of that was investment in organizing. And the stories that I've heard, and obviously Christine and others on this panel were the ones who made it happen, can tell those stories. But to your question on 2024, what we saw was, I think, a bit of a cautionary tale. Nationally, we saw a decrease in turnout relative to 2020 across all groups, but no group decreased more in turnout nationally than more than AAPI voters, who saw a decrease almost identical to the increase we saw from 2016, almost a 10-point decrease. It's not all bad news, though. When you look at the breakdown and you look at the targeted battleground states where there was investment, and also, frankly, where in most of those states the advances in voting access were maintained, you actually saw very minimal decreases in turnout that were in line with other groups. It was in these non-targeted, non-battleground states where, frankly, there wasn't the investment, there wasn't the organizing. In some of these states, they actually rolled back ballot access, especially vote by mail, where you saw massive double-digit decreases. So I think a bit of a cautionary tale, and certainly, I think, something to think about when we look forward into 2025.
You know, sticking with 2025, like also, what do you see in the 2025 Wisconsin Supreme Court race? Is this a forecast of what we may see in Virginia and New Jersey or in the midterms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at Wisconsin, we don't have the full individual vote history from that election, but going back to November 2024, Wisconsin had one of the best turnout records, where API turnout dropped by just over a point relative to 2020, which was already at a huge number. And again, so it was one of the top 5 states in terms of turnout relative to 2020 for the API community. And when you look at that election this year, and the wide margin that we saw for the progressive candidate, the early indicators we have from the vote history was that the API turnout remained strong.
That's wonderful. So I now want to go and focus on the grassroots and turn to Virginia and New Jersey. These are 2 important states that have statewide races this fall. So Amber, New Jersey is often overlooked, and when we look at the margins for the balance of power and the checks and balances, every Senate and congressional race is really important. So, we saw also the election of Senator Andy Kim and investments turning out API voters from his campaign. What have you learned from the 2024 elections that you're going to take with you and will drive what you want to do in 2025?
Thanks, Christine. Who's Andy Kim? No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So the really important thing to understand about Andy Kim is that the energy that he sort of harnessed was really not about anything happening at the federal level. It wasn't even sort of anti-Trump sentiment. It was sort of energy to reform the way that power is controlled in New Jersey. And to cut a very long story short, our ballot design was laid out in a way that really made it an instrument for rubber stamping the will of our county party leaders rather than an impartial instrument for affirming the will of the voters. So around this time last year, Andy Kim was running in a primary against the governor's wife. He had been the first candidate to declare after Senator Bob Menendez was indicted. He had been working 5 to 10 events a day. He was just catching fire all around the state, and yet he was projected to lose the race because he didn't have the endorsement of our democratic machinery. And he filed a lawsuit in federal court claiming that his civil rights were being violated. Again, to sum this up, he won, and that sort of broke open. He's our Luke Skywalker, basically, to use a metaphor that I think he would like himself, right? This Death Star of the party machinery decided whether you lived or died. He had a direct hit on the whatever nuclear generator at the center of it. And now we can see the stars again. And looking at these statewide elections for our entire state assembly, for our governorship, I think we are seeing APIs sort of being I don't have to wait for someone to tap me. I don't have to patiently wait my turn and see exactly how much power this sort of white power structure allows me to have. I can just, I can run for county commissioner. I can run for my town council. Why shouldn't it be me, right? I don't have to run in a heavily Asian district even. So we have I believe 17 API candidates for a state assembly. That's more than we've ever had. I know it doesn't sound like a huge number, but it's exciting for us. And I think we just have to, it's so important because New Jersey is a state with over 1 million Asian American Pacific Islanders. We are 11% of the state, and I think that should be plenty, right, for getting whatever this community needs. We should be feared, we should be respected, and historically we just haven't been because of this failure to invest in our, quote, blue state, which is really just a mix of red and blue and purple. And we've seen that in not just electoral politics, but in state policy making. Like 3 years ago, we went to the State House with an incredible group of Asian American local leaders who had never set foot in there before. They were there to testify about language access. I remember the ED of a South Asian domestic violence nonprofit was testifying about how, because of lack of language access, a woman saying that her husband was strangling her had that translated as like, he was holding my neck. So, and while she was delivering this powerful testimony, our Democratic senators were like scrolling on their phones. They were talking to each other. It was just like such a lack of respect. So federal elections are important, like the same infrastructure that we need to build to have our state policy priorities heard is the exact same we'll need next year when we need to make sure Asian American voters are heard in these toss-up federal districts.
So you talk about issues, right? And it sounded like even though there are things happening at the federal level, there are local issues that really drive the elections. So what are you seeing heading into this fall election?
Yeah, I mean, I think conventional wisdom is that the races at the top of the ticket drive turnout lower down the ticket, but I really don't find that that's the case in heavily Asian enclaves like Edison or Pal Park. Like you drive through these towns and it's the town council race, it's the mayoral race that you see all the signs for and you feel like all this activity around. I think in our Democratic primary for governor, you really don't see a lot of policy differences. You only see differences in experience and background, except on immigration. So that is a key issue for a lot of API voters. But at the same time, if you knock doors in API immigrant areas, they are not talking about immigration. They are talking about affordability, the economy, the cost of health insurance. And I think that just underscores how important it is to not just be super transactional about this and show up as another nonprofit who wants people to do things, right? Like we really have to feed these conversations and the input from our communities back into our work, or otherwise we're not really building a movement. We're just being a nonprofit. And I think these statewide elections that we're having in New Jersey and Virginia are a really key area, key opportunity to test some messaging that we might need in 2026 and 2028. And I will just say, I'm sure Virginia folks will touch on this, but we're struggling with a lot of, anti-immigrant sentiment even within our own communities. I thought our heavily South Asian Middlesex County would be so excited about voting for the first South Asian American presidential candidate. But we saw in our exit polling lots of couples where the wife didn't want to admit she had voted for Kamala Harris. And we saw, real sort of patriarchal influences, I think, influencing the voting there. So there's a lot for us to work through and test.
A lot to unpack, right? Culturally also. So now turning to Virginia, Nivdeep, what are you seeing in terms of trends in Virginia? Especially since, for those that don't know, Virginia has elections every single year.
Yes, we stay quite busy in Virginia, and that's why, as Amber was referring to, that sustained investment in power building is so critical. I think particularly in Virginia, because we are so close to DC, we tend to see a lot of fly in, fly out. National trends seem to dictate the messaging, and therefore there is a loss of what's happening at the local level. And particularly as we think about, as Tom referenced earlier, some of the policy changes and the positive impacts that they're having, such as in Virginia, we're coming on now about 5 years of ability to request mail-in ballots, same-day voter registration, et cetera, which we've seen has increased minority turnout and accessibility at the polls. But again, like the national level, we saw about that drop at about the same 10% average decline in terms of turnout in 2024. One of the big trends, though, that we're seeing in Virginia, as Amber referenced, New Jersey and Virginia are places where there's chances to experiment with messaging, but at the same time, there is a very concentrated effort to experiment with denying access to the polls and removing people from the ballot. In fact, one of the biggest things that we saw last year was within the 90-day federally mandated quiet period where states cannot interfere with voter registration rolls. The governor signed an executive order, and I will let you know that in terms of the state makeup, our legislative assembly is one voter, Senate voter Democratic in the Senate, just barely Democratic held in the assembly, but all three of our elected executive positions are held by Republicans. So we've got that tension going on. But what the governor signed was an order that purged about 7,000 individuals from the voter roll, trying to remove non-citizens from the voter roll. And if you looked at the demographics of Virginia, you would see that, okay, about 41% of the general population is persons of color, but they make up about 25% of registered voters. Yet, 68%, over 2/3 of those who were purged from the voter roll were people of color. And preliminary results of that analysis of purged voters shows that largely Hispanic Latino, but then also disproportionate number of Asian Americans compared to their actual population in Virginia. So what we're seeing is a trend towards Virginia being the place for experimenting to actively get out a message of turnout and civic engagement, but also efforts to suppress that civic engagement.
I want to also follow up a little bit about, you start to talk about messaging. How's messaging impacting the minority vote?
Well, this is where I think that, referring back to EO 35, we can see a little bit of who was according to the models, was more likely to be removed. And we see how this parallels in and ties into the messaging trends. So as we look at the messaging, we've already seen in our upcoming governors and statewide races that candidates and parties have said that immigration, it's going to be a battle of immigration versus economics. And going back to that issue that Amber talked about as to what are the conversations that people think folks are having, well, what are the conversations they're actually having at their kitchen tables. And we are already seeing a ramp up in anti-immigrant messaging, anti-immigrant visibility. DHS is actively using Virginia as the place for all of their photo ops. Secretary Noem has accompanied ICE raids in Virginia in order to drive fear in those communities, which is actually leading into a suppression, leading into concerns around engagement by immigrant-led organizations, people of color-led organizations in these communities, and trying to cut off that year-round civic engagement pipeline. The other part of that, though, that we see in the modeling is that who was less likely to get purged and more likely to have their vote denied? It was typically younger voters, tend to be more progressive, who earn less, and less likely to have gone to college. And that means that they are voters who were more likely to be pro-abortion and pro-immigration.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into a case with Humke in terms of, can you talk a little bit about who you serve and based on your experience also in 2024, what are you doing differently and why?
Yeah, I can do that. And it's also very gratifying to see a lot of folks here from Virginia very active in getting out the Asian American vote here in the audience. So thank you for those in the audience. And it's also great to see so many of my colleagues who are doing this nonpartisan year-round Asian American voter outreach across the state, especially in the South. So hello, North Carolina. Anyways, a couple things that we're doing differently. Again, my name's Soo-Kyung Oh. I'm the executive director of Hamke Center. And we work primarily in Northern Virginia, although we are starting a new civic engagement initiative in Henrico County in Central Virginia, which is the third largest. I was like, ooh, don't piss off the Filipino and Indians in Hampton Roads, where I live. I live in Norfolk, Virginia. So, all right, hey, my husband's in the Navy. Don't come after me. But, so in Central Virginia, we're the third largest hub of Asian American voters. But, what Hamke Center does is we organize year-round. And there's a couple things we're doing differently this year than we have in the past. And I don't just mean from 2024. I mean a break from how we've been doing work in 2023 and 2022. So one thing is we are, and I'm sure many folks who are in the nonprofit field are also feeling this, we are being very thoughtful about compliance. Because I think there's a lot more concern this time around when we're doing canvassing, for example, to make sure to not speak about certain issues that have, whether it's right or wrong, the point is that they get attached to like a certain political party. So if you use, even now, I'm like, can I say these words? Who's recording this? But for example, if you talk about abortion, ding, 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 that's like partisan red flags. Immigrant rights, ding, 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 ding. That's another set of red flags. So I think that's something that I know we're being very thoughtful about to stay C3 compliant. In that vein, we're all, no, not in that vein. Separately, some other things we're doing differently is, in the past, I think what we used to do was we would try to blanket the state as much as we could, like the entire Commonwealth, right? So it would, but to do that, and we're only a certain size, that meant we had to make certain sacrifices, right? So less field, more mail, more phone banking, more text banking. Well, what these past few years have shown us, and what last year shown us, and I'm sure you get this on your phones too. Like if I get my text messages, I didn't realize I have if something is considered spam, it goes into a special spam place. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know my cell phone could do that. And even with caller ID, there's so much more flagging of spam or just so there's more of that I don't know what this number is, so I'm not going to pick it up. As an executive director, I don't have that luxury. I pick up every call I get because you never know who's going to call you, right? But when the folks that we talk to, voters, they've made it very clear, if you're not already in my phone book, I'm not trying to pick up this phone, right? So a couple of changes are we have drastically reduced, and in fact, this year, we're not going to do any phone banking or text banking. It's just not something that I know. I'm and more power to you if you are doing it. We have just found that in our experience, the modality, the voter direct voter contact modality that's most effective is talking to people face to face, and that is either at the doors or doing hotspot canvassing, right? Hands down. So again, it's great. If you have a few extra people who can set up the phone bank and the text bank, go for it. But if you're expecting any kind of contact rate above 1%, I want to know who your data vendor is, okay? Because ours is even at less than 1%. So much more emphasis on the doors. And this year, what we're doing is we are going to doors that we've already gone to before. And so we're betting on 5 different places in Virginia. Centerville and Annandale, which are in Fairfax County, Sterling, which is in Loudoun County, Woodbridge in Prince William County, and then the west end portion of Henrico County. Why these 5 places in these 4 counties? Because 50% of Asian American voters live in those 4 counties, and a great proportion of Asian American voters in those counties live in those 5 places. And the point is that we go to them year round, right? Again and again and again, so they know Hamke Center, Hamke Center, Hamke Center. Because the huge thing, I know we've been talking about policy barriers to voting, but and I don't know what the right wording or terminology for this is, but we're also seeing almost like I don't want to call it ideological, but there's like a cultural barrier or an idea barrier of voting, which is we have certain folks in governance now that have eroded, I believe, and from what we can tell from talking with Asian American voters, people's trust in government, people's trust in governance, and people's trust in democracy. So we're trying to think, it's going to take more than civic engagement this year to reach out to voters. And so at Hamke Center, we're also using all of our other programming, our direct service provision, our issue-based organizing to earn people's trust again. Because that, I think, is, it's not just about the voter ID. And yeah, we have to follow those policies, but it's to try to encourage people to vote again. There was a drop-off in 2024. There are a lot of reasons for that, okay? And we're going to try to address as many of them as we can, but certainly one that we see in Virginia is trust.
So, going back to that trust issue, and you're doing this year round, I think that's also the beauty and the value of nonpartisan, nonprofit work, because we are there in the community year round. Are there particular issues or things that you're hearing or you're resonating? Or, once again, because you're going to see them all the time, what are the things, what are you discussing with them?
So I think it's less about discussing; it's a lot more listening, right? And a couple of other things that we've noticed is at least in Virginia, what we notice is that the drop-off in Asian American voter turnout seems to be more in lower income voters, and we also are seeing that there are some, we call them our core geographies, some places like Annandale and Centerville, we've been there now like 3-4 years in a row. But in places like Woodbridge and Sterling, where this is really our last year was our first time really reaching out to voters, that the voter turnout, the gap between the percentage of Asian American registered voters and Asian American turnout that gap is bigger in places where we've only just started working versus places where we have been working at least 3 to 4 years. Again, I can't completely, unless we, pay probably thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars to do some sort of independent analysis. I don't want to sit here and go, oh yeah, it's because of Hamke Center. But certainly there's an argument here around what happens when you have people who come out to your doors, to your markets, to your places of worship, and there's no expectation. There's no partisan expectation. Like, we're not here because we want you to vote for a particular party or a particular candidate, which is what, Christine is saying about the unique role C3s can play, right? The transaction really is not like, well, you're not doing me any favor. You're not doing me a favor if you vote, right? Which is what happens if you go out as a C4 or if you go out as a partisan actor. But we're instead talking about our community power that can only be expressed if you vote. And at that point, that's on you to vote or not. That's not on me. And again, there's no necessary benefit to Hamke Center or to API New Jersey if you do, right? Other than, I guess, maybe later we can take some credit, but, even then. So it's been, I think, these sorts of differences that we're really excited to try out in 2025. As we go into our governor's race and House of Delegates races this year.
Wonderful. So, Tom, I want to go back to you. You just heard a lot in terms of what we're doing in terms of Virginia and New Jersey, but I'm also curious, what are some trends that you're also seeing, not only in the API community, but also other minority voters?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, a lot of what we saw in 2024 and what we are seeing going forward in the AAPI community has been echoed in other communities of color, meaning when we look at that drop in turnout, I mentioned that the turnout dropped universally,
Right.
nationally. Almost every group dropped in turnout relative to 2020. It was just more pronounced among the API voters. But you're seeing the same with Latino voters, African American voters, Native American voters. Across the board, again, relative difference, and the API turnout drop was most substantial. As Suk-Young said, the biggest drop-offs in the API community were among the lowest income voters, and that is echoed again among other communities of color, younger voters, and unaffiliated voters. Those are the trends that we're seeing. They're also the voters who have moved the most in the national opinion polls, who have actually swung against the current administration more than any other group, for what it's worth.
Wonderful. We only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to maybe we'll start with Navdeep and go down. Are there any other last comments that you want to leave with the audience, especially, we're hoping that everyone here will also actively, wherever state or a region that you're in, that you'll go home and actually get involved, but we want to also give you some ideas in terms of how you could do that.
So we can do all the data analysis we want. We can pour all the money into messaging and fine-tuning, focus groups, et cetera, that we want. But at the end of the day, if we're not investing in long-term power building in our communities, training people not just on the campaign side, but how to be organizers, how to be advocates, we're not building power. And without that power, we could never have our own Luke Skywalker.
I think the data has shown that whatever your political leanings, you will lose ground in policy and politics if you do not invest in relational organizing, which is just another way of saying community building. I did compare Senator Kim to Luke Skywalker. You probably know my leanings, but I embrace the nonpartisan C3-ness of it all because our state's heavily gerrymandered anyway, so I don't have to worry about turning out like the wrong people or anything. Like I sincerely want all Asian Americans to participate more. And the bonus is that the infrastructure you build for that to happen is the same you need to build healthy, happy communities where Asian Americans are connected with each other, like the Wichita Asian Americans Association.
Going into this year, for Hamke Center, throughout all of our programming, we've been thinking a lot about trust. How it's not there. It just, you've got to, we're getting messages from external places around not trusting. Do you trust vaccines? Do you trust what your teachers are teaching your kids? Do you trust what books your kids are reading in libraries? Do you can you even trust what is printed in mainstream news outlets? There's, I think, a much longer term project that, and this is affecting Asian Americans, right? Where we talk, you talk to your aunts, your parents. Where do they get your young people? Where do people get their news, right? So I think there's, for us, whether it's civic engagement, service provision, issue-based organizing, and advocacy, we have to think deeply about what are we doing to earn Asian American people's trust again.
Well, thank you so much for all these wonderful insights. I also want to point out that we have also other partners in the audience. We have the North Carolina Asian Americans Together, and then also from Nevada, Asian Community Development Council. I encourage all of you during your breaks to talk to any of our partners so we could dig in deeper. Hopefully next time we can also dig in a little bit deeper about young voters, as we keep hearing that is something that we need to dive deeper in. But with that, I just want to thank once again Tom, Suk-Young, Amber, and Navdeep. Thank you everyone for this conversation.